What is the impact of lead poisoning on albatross chicks living on Midway Island? That's the question posed by a Switzer Foundation research project. This is Switzer Network News.
Laysan albatross breed on Midway Island, and Midway Island used to be a military base. And when the military occupied the island, they put up all these buildings and painted the buildings with lead-based paint. So during my graduate research, I established that the Laysan albatross chicks were being lead poisoned by ingesting lead-based paint. And I published that work in 2003. After I published the paper and graduated, I was concerned that the lead-based paint wasn't being cleaned up. So the Switzer Foundation funded me as a leadership grant to partner with the American Bird Conservancy and work on policy to try to get the lead-based paint cleaned up on Midway and save the Laysan albatross chicks that are being lead poisoned. Their wings become paralyzed, which is a condition called peripheral neuropathy, and they drag on the ground, and then they break and they get open sores, and it's really horrific if you see it. So as you can imagine, I've been motivated to try to clean up this problem since I observed it in 2000. So for the Laysan albatross study, it's a kind of a nice project because it involves many different levels. So it involved going to the island, taking blood samples, measuring lead levels in the birds, doing something called isotopic fingerprinting of the lead, which basically determined where the lead poisoning was coming from, what was the source. And from doing this sort of specialized analysis, which requires, specific types of instruments and ultra clean trace metal techniques, we could determine that the chicks were being poisoned by lead-based paint. And that's another way that's important, because even if you know that the chicks are lead poisoned, you can't really do anything about it if you don't know what's causing the poisoning. So you have to identify the source. And you want to be sure, because you don't want people to spend resources on something that's not going to be effective. So fortunately for lead, we could be sure. So we did isotopic fingerprinting of paint chips and of the lead in the blood and determined it was the lead-based paint. And so from that work, I've been working for the last many, many years with the American Bird Conservancy, the Fish and Wildlife Service, to sort of say, well, what actions need to be taken to clean the lead-based paint off the island? And the problem is that it costs a lot of money, and that the military no longer is responsible for the cleanup of the buildings because they turned over the jurisdiction to the Fish and Wildlife Service. So we were running into problems because even though we knew that many, many chicks died per year, this horrible death, it was hard to sort of compare that to other threats to Laysan albatross. So through other fellowship work, I basically did some quantitative modeling to establish, well, how does the lead poisoning affect the whole population survival of Laysan albatross? Especially when you compare it to other threats, such as being killed as in fishery bycatch operations, because we know fisheries bycatch kills many albatross per year. By working with quantitative modelers, I was able to basically quantify the problem and say, okay, well, if we clean up the lead-based paint today, I know that because about 7% of the chicks born on the island die from lead poisoning each year. So in 50 years, we'll have 190,000 more birds. And so with numbers like that, you can start putting it into some sort of context so that you can allocate resources or lobby for resources to be used effectively. Since I started the leadership grant in 2004, Fish and Wildlife Service did start partially cleaning up the lead-based paint. And to date, they've cleaned up maybe about 20 of the 90 buildings on the island. So they're working on it with the limited resources that they have. But my goal is to sort of try to help them get more resources to clean it up faster. Because the lead-based paint, unfortunately, is getting worse over time. The buildings are getting older and older each year. More and more paint is disintegrating off the buildings, getting on the island, and more chicks are potentially exposed and dying from lead poisoning. It's important to basically use science and research to help dictate and guide conservation efforts and cleanup efforts, because again, we have lots of problems and lots of things that we could clean up. I mean, we know lead-based paint is bad. We know that it's why we don't use it anymore. I mean, it's banned in the United States. But I also feel like we need to be effective at how we go about trying to fix what we've done wrong. And so I try to do the research to help guide responsible and efficient and prioritize restoration efforts so that we can be the most effective at cleaning up and saving the species. Even if you don't really care about what happens to Laysan albatross on Midway, maybe you would care about a couple of things, such as how are we going to these places and altering the environment, impacting the different species that live there, and contaminating the environment for also human use. People are very affected by lead-based paint and lead poisoning. It's a huge human health hazard. So if we care about keeping these areas pristine for also human visitation, we should care about what they're doing to the wildlife. And if we care about keeping sort of the world as we know it, and keeping the species that live here today, live here tomorrow for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, then we should care about how the contaminants are impacting them. Because in particular, Laysan albatross populations now are believed to be declining. So if we don't do something to intervene and help them, we won't have them for our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren. And do we want to be responsible for that? I mean, do we want to say, well, we could have done something to make the world, a better place, but we didn't?
For more information about this topic, please visit our website. This is Switzer Network News.